Hello, folks. Today we're going to begin patient assessment by talking about an inhibitor to patient assessment. And I think of this as the blind spot in patient assessment, because if we are not even aware that it's there, or if we forget to look to see if it's there, or take extra care by looking over our shoulder to see if it's there, like we do in a car, we might miss it. And we all know what happens when we pull into our blind spot if there is something there that we didn't recognize, right? So imagine that you've been born and you come into this world and your vision is just blurry, and you make out these faces in between your naps, and you're napping quite a bit. And as time goes by, you tend to see these faces more than any others because they're your parents. But your parents' parents or your grandparents show up and come to visit, and your Aunt Monica comes over all the time. Your uncles come over to celebrate your birthday, as do your other grandparents, and your Aunt Phoebe drops in on you very often as well. And by the time you're about this age, you start to recognize, or you've already recognized these people as being very, very familiar in your life. And you recognize them on sight. You have no anxiety about unfamiliarity. They're your world. And by the time you're 9 months old, you probably haven't seen faces like this that often. So that they're so infrequent, especially compared to what you see day in and day out, that your brain begins to classify them as other, so much so that they all seem remarkably similar to you as being other. And this is called the other race effect, and there are signs that it appears at 3 days of age, where an infant will gaze on a face that they've come to recognize and will avoid looking at faces that they don't recognize. So if we consider that our parents are bathing us and caring for us and taking us out on errands and letting us watch TV, and eventually we go to school and we're constantly surrounded by people that we come into contact with on a daily basis, and then we think about what these people look like on a daily basis, we'll see that the faces often appear similar, statistically, to the Caucasian baby in particular, to the faces that raised them. And so we're surrounded by these faces in media and in our day-to-day lives because these are the faces that tend to be in these positions most frequently. And so those faces become even more familiar, and the faces that we don't see as frequently continue to become or stay unfamiliar. So this is really a function of anatomy and physiology. The hippocampus in the brain, this tiny little structure, is integral and works in tandem with portions of the brain that trigger the fight or flight fear response, the sympathetic response. And if you see faces often enough, and it gets learned that it's being familiar, then the hippocampus habituates. In other words, it gets used to what it knows and does not react or trigger the fight or flight response. However, for faces that it doesn't know, the fight or flight response is triggered, but not in the way that we think of. It's more a low-level anxiety that gets triggered instead. Okay, and that's just simply a function of not being familiar with certain faces. We develop a low-level avoidant type of anxiety, not in the palpable way, though, that we think of anxiety. We just want to avoid what's not familiar. So we imagine these little kids that are hanging out with their parents or interacting mostly with people that probably look like them. And let's extrapolate what happens then. So we find that as these children grow up and they become adults, they start to interact with other children differently. And we see that teachers will pay attention or to students in a different way. So they'll give eye contact to the boys, inviting a response, but they'll pay attention or observe and look out for behaviors from boys of color, expecting them to misbehave. So the attention that's being given to children based on color and gender is different already as well. And not only are the adults exhibiting this trait, but by the time children go to preschool, they too begin to exhibit bias based on race, ethnicity, and gender. And I thought this picture was pretty interesting, that the person that's got access to the crayons is the minority in that group, and yet is kind of following a certain stratification that we see in society today. So the question becomes, what do we do with that bias if we're aware of it? Well, if we're not aware of it, and we start to form ideas about what's happening with other ethnicities or genders or ages of people, and bias can run any gamut you please, we actually inadvertently and subconsciously start to confirm what we actually think in a visceral sense, and that's called confirmation bias. So we tend to see what will confirm what we already think, or we tend to notice what will confirm what we think and then disregard what might disagree with it. That's just something people do across the board. But if we look at what happens because of unrecognized bias, we can see that, well, one, we have huge gaps in wealth. So somehow white people tended to do far better after this Great Recession in 2007 and 8, and black people fared much worse. Latino people didn't do quite as poorly as black people did in the end, but they still took a hit in the accumulation of wealth. We can look at how gender extrapolates compared with race and ethnicity as well. And we can see that even with advanced degrees, we still see a disparity some across all levels. Even your likelihood of being hired can be impaired. So for example, we have names that sound typically white or typically black, okay, and I don't like those labels, but this is the parameters of the study, and you can see that people that had very Caucasian sounding names were far more likely to get callbacks for jobs. So the likelihood of your being hired could be affected just by whether or not someone thought your race could be implied, your ethnicity could be implied by your name. And then we look at something that's far more pertinent to our purposes, the rates of death and disease by race and ethnicity. And, choose your disease process. If you are a person of color, you're not going to fare as well as a white person, regardless of the disease process you suffer from. And then we can also consider that there are a myriad of studies that outline how healthcare providers will often play a role in patient outcomes, and the role we play is often influenced by our implicit bias, whether that's a bias about ethnicity, whether it's a bias about gender, about age, about whether or not a person is obese or not, a person's gender identity, a person's orientation. But the biggest disparity we see is when we look at ethnicity and gender. So if we look at again, death rates, which is the worst case scenario. If you are Black, you have the most dire likelihood that you will die from any given disease process. There is, I believe, there is an exception to this. You can see that I believe it's Native Americans, their death rate from diabetes is higher than a Black person's for diabetes. But other than that, Black people have the highest death rate. So the question becomes a couple questions. Is implicit bias part of this? And we have to wonder, or at least I have to wonder, if it might be because it's affecting so many parts of a person's life, their income, their accumulation of wealth, their ability to get a job, right down to their health. We know that the attention people get or don't get in school is affected by this. Rates of incarceration are different based on gender and ethnicity, even accounting or taking into consideration the crime that's been committed. So it's comprehensive. And so the reason I bring this up today is for us to consider it. Just let it be on our map, because denial is the first stage of implicit bias, and it's integral to the maintenance of bias. Without denial, bias cannot continue to exist, in fact. And the studies are promising in that regard, too. Once people become aware of it, they can't unsee it anymore, and then it can't play the same role as it once did. So that's the good news there. But if we deny it, if we are selective about the reality we accept, that is just simply another form of denial, isn't it? So if we go back to this slide that talks about the hippocampus and familiarity, we can already find one of a myriad of pathways to break through bias. And it's about familiarity. We can look at it from an anatomic feature, a physiological response, if you will, that if we increase our familiarity with people that are different from ourselves, we store that information in the memory portions of our brain, so that our hippocampus doesn't get so irritable, because no longer is that other to us anymore. So in many instances, diversity really is going to be the solution. And we can see already that our need and desire for diversity is starting to change things more recently since these congressional races. And if you're interested in reading more about this, the authors of the implicit association test, the people who designed the test that for 2 decades has been utilized in ferreting out implicit bias, this is the book, and it can be, well, for me it was earth-shattering. But the reason I bring this topic up is the first few seconds we set eyes on our patients can set into motion a pattern or a path of behavior and assessment, or lack thereof, that can end up leading to a higher incidence of death for people of color, people of certain genders, people of certain age. And there are study after study after study that support this, that the way we assess patients of color is less effective. We spend less time with them. We ask fewer questions. We offer less aggressive treatments. We assume they won't be compliant with the directions we give them. We treat their pain less frequently. The list is pretty impressive, while at the same time being depressive, if you will. So I bring this up so that we can just be aware that this might be here, and to double check ourselves. If we start to engage or feel a sense of wanting to avoid something about our patient, we might be triggered in a way that we just aren't really aware of, because of some small section of our brain that is triggering some slight discomfort or anxiety simply because we're not familiar with this type of person. So if you sense that on some visceral level, pay attention just momentarily to say, I recognize that and I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to readjust, recalibrate, and assess this patient as well as any other patient. And so that's the beginning of patient assessment, is those first few seconds of laying eyes on your patient and not letting that small section of your brain that can create such large responses dictate your behavior. So thanks for your attention, and we will move forward with other aspects of patient assessment. But in the meantime, following this are the references, or at least a good many of the references that I found for this short little presentation. Thanks, and have a great day.